retired Navy SEAL, thought the war was over until he found 8 forgotten German shepherds guarding an old truck in the Montana cold. One look at the scarred leader of the pack told him these were not strays, but lost working dogs from a team that should have disappeared years ago. What he uncovered was even more heartbreaking. An elderly couple had spent years saving the broken dogs that the world, and the men who once loved them, could no longer keep. But as the dogs' old wounds, night terrors, and failing bodies began to surface, the SEAL realized this was no longer just a reunion. It was a rescue running out of time. Then one collapse, one hidden illness, and one final promise forced him to face the truth that these wounded dogs had been saving human lives all along. In the end, the old soldier, the forgotten dogs, and the grieving couple did not just survive each other's pain. They became the home that healed it. If this story touches your heart, tell us where you are watching from, or share your thoughts after listening. And please, like and subscribe to help us reach 1,000 subscribers so we can keep bringing you more unforgettable stories. Nathan Brooks had learned, after enough funerals, that grief did not always arrive like thunder. Sometimes it came like cold sunlight on a windshield. Sometimes it came in the silence, after a folded flag was placed into trembling hands. Sometimes it sat beside a man for 70 miles of Montana road and said nothing at all. At 58, Nathan still looked like the kind of man who made younger men step aside without being told. He stood a shade over 6 feet, lean and hard through the shoulders, built by years of work rather than vanity. His dark brown hair was clipped in the old military way, a little longer now than regulations once allowed, and the skin of his face was light but roughened by northern wind, and too many winters spent outdoors. He kept his jaw clean-shaven, though a faint shadow of beard still darkened the square line of it by late afternoon. His eyes were gray-blue, the kind of eyes that always seemed to be measuring distance, exits, weather, and people all at once. That morning those eyes looked tired. He had driven to the memorial service of a former teammate near Billings, stood through the prayers, shaken too many hands, accepted too many murmured versions of, "He is at peace now," and then left before the casseroles came out. Nathan had never known what to do with food after sorrow. It felt too ordinary, too warm, too alive. So he drove west, the old highway unspooled through open country under a pale sky. Dry grass bent in the wind. Cottonwoods stood in scattered clusters near irrigation ditches, their leaves flashing silver. By late afternoon he passed a small town that seemed held together by habit, faith, and rust. There was a gas station with 2 pumps, a diner with a crooked sign, a church with white paint peeling from the steps, and beyond them a weathered RV lot pressed against a line of poplars. Nathan would have passed it. He almost did. Then he saw the dogs. There were 8 of them, 8 old German shepherds, black and tan, large, framed, and grizzled, gathered around a faded Ford step van that had once been white and now wore the color of dust, old snow, and stubborn survival. None of the dogs barked. None ran toward the road. They were spread in quiet positions around the van, as if each had chosen a sector and meant to hold it. Nathan's hand tightened on the steering wheel. Then one of the dogs rose. He did it slowly, with discipline instead of weakness. His rear right leg took weight a half-second late, not like an ordinary old dog stiff with age, but like a dog long trained to compensate for an old working injury. Nathan knew that motion. He knew it the way a pianist knows a single note struck in another room. He hit the brakes so hard the truck behind him honked. Nathan pulled onto the gravel shoulder and sat still, one hand braced on the wheel, heart beating much too hard for a man who had only seen dogs beside a van. "No," he whispered to the empty cab, but the word had no force in it. It sounded less like refusal than fear. Across the lot, an old man knelt beside a portable generator with the patient focus of someone who had spent a lifetime repairing things other people gave up on. Walter Harris was 76, narrow-shouldered now with age but still wiry through the arms. His hands were dark with grease and lined like old leather. Thick white hair clung around the sides of his head beneath a battered cap, and a short white beard framed a face cut by years of weather and worry. His movements were careful, economical, and proud. He looked like a man who had learned long ago that dignity often sounded like saying little. Near the van stood a woman with a tray of pill bottles in her hands. Margaret Harris was 73, small and straight-backed despite the years, with soft silver hair twisted into a loose knot at the nape of her neck. Her face held fine wrinkles around the mouth and eyes, not bitter lines but tired ones, the map of a woman who had spent more of her life caring for others than speaking about herself. She wore a navy coat over a cream sweater, and though her expression was gentle, there was something steady in her gaze, the kind of steadiness nurses carried, the kind that did not panic when others did. She crouched beside the first dog, touched his muzzle, and murmured something Nathan could not hear. The dog opened his mouth obediently and swallowed the pills from her palm. Nathan felt the old chill move under his skin. Not pets, he thought, not ordinary pets. He parked across from the lot and got out. The wind smelled of cold dirt, gasoline, and wood smoke from somewhere deeper in town. He told himself he was only stretching his legs, only looking, only passing through. A woman in a quilted red vest was standing near the step van, purse open, a folded bill pinched in her fingers. She was somewhere in her 60s, broad-faced and pink from the wind, the kind of local woman who brought casseroles, knew everybody's trouble, and called it neighborliness instead of surveillance. "Walter," she said, holding out the money, "please just take it this once." Walter did not even look up from the generator. "If you want to help Linda, buy anti-inflammatory meds," he said. His voice was rough but not rude. "Money disappears. Medicine doesn't." Linda sighed, not offended, only sad in the practiced way of someone who had heard that answer before. "You cannot keep doing this alone." Walter finally glanced at her. "Been doing it this long." Margaret gave Linda a small apologetic smile. "He means thank you. I know what he means," Linda said, but she slipped the bill back into her purse. Nathan kept walking slowly along the edge of the lot. One of the dogs turned his head and tracked him. Then another, then all at once, without noise, every shepherd in the place shifted attention toward him. It was not the unfocused alertness of house dogs. It was evaluation, assessment, a perimeter adjusting to a new arrival. Nathan stopped. The largest of them stood near the rear wheel of the van. He was old, maybe 13, with a broad chest gone a little thin from age, and a black saddle faded to brown at the edges. His muzzle had silvered, a narrow scar ran over his left shoulder, and another smaller mark sat above his left eye. His amber eyes were not soft. They were watchful and measuring, full of that unnerving patience seen in beings who had once worked under pressure and had never forgotten it. The dog took 3 steps forward, not threatening, not friendly, just enough to say, "I see you." Nathan's throat tightened. He had seen dogs hold themselves like that, outside compounds, in places most Americans would never hear named correctly on the evening news. He had seen them in rotor wash and red dust, their ears flat, muscles quivering, waiting for commands from men who trusted them with life and death. The old shepherd lifted his lame rear leg with that same careful pattern again. Nathan felt memory strike him in the ribs. A training ground near Coronado, salt air, a dog vaulting from a landing craft ramp, one bad impact, weeks of rehab, a handler swearing the dog would still outwork half the unit. His pulse stumbled. The shepherd stopped a few yards away and sat, not by chance, by decision, and in that instant, something deep inside Nathan, something buried under years of funerals and paperwork and disciplined forgetting, shifted awake. He had almost turned away then. He almost told himself grief was making ghosts out of old dogs. He almost went back to his truck. But the wind changed, bringing with it the scent of liniment, kibble, machine oil, and wet fur, and the old shepherd did something stranger than standing guard. He looked past Nathan, not at the road, not at the town, but at the horizon behind him, as if expecting someone else to arrive. Nathan had seen that too. Dogs waiting for a convoy that never came. He did not go back to the truck. Instead, he stepped closer. Margaret straightened, pills still in hand. "Can I help you?" Her tone was polite, though the smallest tremor in her fingers made the capsules click softly in the bottle. Nathan noticed it, because he noticed everything, but she tucked that hand into her coat pocket almost at once, as if she did not want strangers measuring her weakness. "I was just passing through," Nathan said. Walter snorted lightly at that. Folks who are just passing through don't stop for old dogs. Nathan almost smiled. "Guess I'm not just passing through then." Up close, the van looked less like a vehicle than a life held together by stubbornness. Solar panels had been bolted onto the roof. Blankets were folded inside the windshield. Metal bowls lined one side on a rubber mat. A neat plastic crate of veterinary supplies sat just inside the side door. Everything had its place. Everything had been made to continue. Margaret resumed handing out medicine. As she moved among the dogs, Nathan studied them one by one. One had a cloudy left eye. Another favored a front paw. One stayed always near Margaret's left side, body angled slightly outward. One refused the offered treat until Walter stood and nodded. Once. Another never stopped scanning the road. No barking, no chaos, no wasted motion. His unease deepened. These all wiped his hands on a rag. "They're with us." It was not an answer, which meant it probably was. Nathan crouched a little, enough to bring himself nearer the dog's eye line without presenting challenge. The big shepherd by the rear wheel watched him without blinking. Nathan could see old damage in the teeth, small chips at the canines, the sort of wear that did not come from tennis balls and backyard fences. "What's his name?" Nathan asked quietly. Margaret looked at Walter before answering, as if names mattered here. "Ranger," she said. "Ranger, it was a plain name. Common enough, safe enough." But somehow Nathan felt disappointment and relief at once. Relief because it was not a name he already feared. Disappointment because part of him, the irrational broken part, had wanted impossible certainty. Linda lingered a moment longer, then waved and headed toward her sedan. "I'll bring the meds tomorrow, Margaret." "You don't have to," Margaret called. "I know. That's why I will." Nathan watched her go. Small-town kindness. The kind that survived because people pretended it was nothing. Walter lifted the generator cord and gave it a sharp pull. The machine coughed, sputtered, then caught. A low mechanical hum settled over the lot. At once 2 of the shepherds relaxed by a fraction, as if some system they had been quietly monitoring was now secure. That was wrong too, or rather too specific to be ordinary. Nathan moved toward Ranger. The old dog remained seated, spine straight despite the years. Up close, the scar above his eye looked old enough to have faded into the fur. The collar around his neck was dark leather, cracked from age and weather, with a brass buckle rubbed nearly dull. "Nathan," Margaret said. He looked up sharply. She offered a faint smile. "Your truck has veteran plates. Seems safer than calling you, sir." He nodded once. "Nathan." "Navy?" she asked. He hesitated. "Used to be." Walter grunted. "That explains the stare." Nathan might have answered, but his eyes had dropped to Ranger's collar. The leather had folded inward from long wear. A corner near the buckle had curled just enough to reveal the inside. There, pressed into the faded underside, were 3 worn words, barely visible unless the light hit them right. Nathan leaned closer. The wind seemed to stop around him. For a moment he could not hear the generator or the distant highway or Linda's car leaving the lot. He could only see the letters Aries Team. He stared as if the old leather had become a live thing. His face lost color. Walter said something, but Nathan did not hear it. 9 years collapsed inward. 9 years of files, transfers, signatures, sealed boxes, men looking away from the names of dogs because it hurt less that way. Nathan took 1 slow step back. Ranger rose with that same careful hind leg, eyes never leaving him. Nathan's mouth had gone dry. Aries Team, he said, and the words felt like opening a grave. His gaze lifted from the collar to the line of old shepherds around the van, to Margaret with her medicine tray, to Walter standing in grease-stained silence, and then back to Ranger. Aries Team, he whispered again, but this time the shock in his voice was plain. He looked as though he had seen the dead return wearing fur and scars. Then he said the only thing in his mind that made any sense at all. Aries Team was disbanded 9 years ago. Nathan Brooks did not leave the RV lot that evening. He told himself it was because the road had gone dim and the temperature was dropping, because the town had only 1 motel, and he had no interest in thin walls and brighter memories. But that was not the truth, and he knew it. The truth was standing on 4 aging legs beside a weathered step van, wearing a cracked leather collar that should not have existed. He remained by his truck for several minutes after speaking those last words, watching the old couple and the dogs through the windshield, as the Montana dusk thickened into a soft blue cold. A church bell rang somewhere in town. A freight train groaned in the distance. The shepherds shifted positions around the van with such quiet intention that Nathan felt the back of his neck tighten. Not once did they move like pets waiting for dinner. They moved like a unit settling for the night. By the time he stepped out again, Walter Harris had packed away his tools. Up close, the old mechanic looked even leaner than before, a man reduced by age but not defeated by it. Grease still shadowed the lines of his knuckles. His flannel shirt hung loosely on his narrow frame beneath a faded denim jacket, and the set of his mouth suggested a man who had spent most of his life fixing engines, because machines, unlike people, did not lie about what was broken. Margaret Harris was near the side door of the step van, arranging folded blankets inside. Her movements were gentle but precise. She was smaller than Nathan had first thought, and in the porch light fastened above the van's door, the skin of her face looked soft and thin as old paper, yet there was nothing fragile in the way she worked. She carried quiet authority, the way some women wore perfume. "You planning to stare all night?" Walter asked, without heat. Nathan exhaled through his nose. "I was thinking about finding a place to stay." Walter glanced at the sky. "Town motels got plumbing that cries louder than a Baptist widow. You can park over there if you don't mind the cold." Nathan looked where Walter nodded. There was an open stretch of gravel beside a narrow fence line. "You always invite strangers to sleep near 8 shepherds." Walter shrugged. "If they mean trouble, the dogs will know before I do." Nathan should have taken offense. Instead, he found himself almost respecting the answer. He parked where Walter suggested and returned on foot with a small tool bag in hand, using the oldest excuse men like him had ever trusted. "I know generators," he said. "If that one gives you trouble again, I can take a look." Walter studied him for a long moment, then lifted one shoulder. "Won't say no to an extra pair of hands." It was permission, though it sounded nothing like welcome. For the next hour, Nathan stayed near the van under the pretense of helping with small repairs. He adjusted a fuel line, tightened a battery clamp, checked a cracked extension cord. None of it required his full attention. Most of his attention belonged to the dogs. He counted them again. 8. The oldest, Ranger, remained the axis around which the others seemed to turn. He was large for his age, black and tan with a silvered muzzle and a scar across the left shoulder, his amber eyes too steady for an ordinary house dog. When he sat square. When he rose, the old hitch in his rear leg appeared and vanished with practiced control. Another shepherd lay near the front tire, broader through the chest, his ears still sharp and erect, though his muzzle had frosted almost white. A piece of the right ear was missing, as cleanly notched as if taken by metal rather than teeth. He watched Walter the way old bodyguards watch presidents, not with affection first, but duty first. "That's Shadow," Margaret said when she noticed Nathan looking. 12? Maybe a little more. He hears less now, but not what matters. Shadow did not move, though one eye narrowed on Nathan. A lighter-colored shepherd with a paler tan coat slept near the van door. One front leg stretched stiffly outward, as if the joint never fully loosened anymore. A dark female, slimmer than the rest, remained almost glued to Margaret's position, rising each time the older woman shifted. Farther out, one gaunt shepherd paced the edge of the gravel lot and never once gave his back to the highway. Nathan watched them trade places as the light faded. 2 lay down, 3 remained upright. One took the road, one stayed near Margaret. One did not touch the bowl of food until Walter came near and rested a hand on the van's side. That was when Nathan stopped pretending he might be wrong. This was not age alone, it was pattern, a system. Training layered so deeply into bone that even time and pain had not erased it. Margaret came down the metal step holding a dented pot. "Coffee." Nathan took the offered mug. "Thank you." "It's terrible," she said. He drank. She was right. Still better than hotel coffee. That made her smile. They stood in companionable silence for a while. The lot had grown still, except for the hum of the generator and the soft scrape of paws over gravel. A pale moon rose behind thin clouds. "Where did they come from?" Nathan asked. Margaret did not answer at once. She looked toward Walter, who was kneeling beside a storage bin, sorting canned food from medicine. Walter shut the lid with more force than needed. Same as most creatures do. Trouble. Nathan waited. After a moment, Margaret spoke, perhaps because she was gentler, perhaps because she understood that some men needed truth in fragments before they could bear the whole shape of it. "They didn't come together," she said. "That's what people always assume. Like they arrived in a parade, and we lost our minds all at once." Nathan almost smiled into the mug. "Ranger came first," she continued. "Then Shadow, almost a year later. After that, there was never a pattern anybody else would have called a pattern. Just phone calls, one knock after midnight, one shelter worker who knew Walter would answer, one widow who couldn't lift a feeding sack anymore, one old vet who said he had run out of time and wanted to know if somebody decent still existed in Montana. Walter grunted softly. Didn't say it that nicely. Margaret ignored him. Some came with papers, some without. One came with a stitched-up shoulder and no name at all. One came from a county shelter, 3 towns over. One was left tied to the side mirror with a note so wet from snow we could only read half of it. Nathan held the mug motionless in both hands. Not one event, then. Not one tragedy. A slow procession of endings. "How long?" he asked. Walter answered this time. 9 years, give or take. The number landed heavily. 9 years ago, the same year. Nathan looked at Ranger, who had moved closer without seeming to move at all. The old dog stood within arm's reach now, head lifted, eyes reflecting the porch light like dark honey. Walter followed Nathan's gaze and said, "They were never strays." Nathan said nothing. "They knew things when they got here," Walter went on. "How to wait, how to watch doors, how to circle a vehicle before settling, how to sleep light, how to keep one another in view. They knew men in uniforms made some of them shake and others stand taller. They knew fireworks were not celebrations. A dry wind moved across the lot. Somewhere a metal sign rattled. Nathan felt something cold and old turning in his chest. Margaret set down the empty pot and knelt beside the dark female shepherd. "This one's Rosie," she said. "She follows me when my hands are bad." Nathan looked at her. Margaret's expression did not change, but she drew her hands briefly into the sleeves of her sweater, as though hiding them from the air. Rosie pressed against her side with full, calm confidence. A black and tan shepherd around 11 years old, her face finer than the male's, her gaze bright and attuned. She watched Nathan just long enough to measure him, then turned back toward Margaret's breathing, as if that mattered more. The moment passed. Walter reached for a sack of kibble. The broad-chested dog with the torn ear stood first, then another, then another. Yet none approached the food bowls until Walter gave a short nod. Nathan's heartbeat slowed and deepened in the way it used to before a mission, not from fear, but from recognition. He had seen that nod before. Not the exact man, not the exact angle, but the communication inside it. Permission without noise, routine built from repetition, trust made visible only to those who knew how to read it. Then something happened that made the hair rise on Nathan's arms. Ranger did not go to his bowl. He remained standing beside Nathan, body still, ears slightly forward. Walter gave the same nod again, more clearly this time. Still Ranger did not move. Instead, the old shepherd turned his head toward Nathan's left hand. Nathan looked down. He had unconsciously lifted 2 fingers while holding the coffee mug, an old habit from years of signaling dogs and men when silence mattered more than speech. Ranger's body changed at once, not dramatically, no theatrical display, just a quiet, unmistakable shift. His head lowered half an inch. His weight eased back. He waited. Nathan's hand slowly fell to his side. Ranger stayed there, eyes on him, patient as memory. Margaret saw it. Nathan knew she saw it because her face went very still. Walter saw it too, though he hid it better. For a few seconds nobody spoke. Then Walter turned away and began filling bowls as if the earth had not just tipped beneath them. Nathan set the coffee mug down on the van's metal step with more care than it required. He could hear was no accident, no random old dog behavior. Ranger had responded to a hand cue, not voice, not food, not chance, hand cue, the kind drilled into working dogs so thoroughly that it survived chaos, distance, and damaged hearing. The kind used when helicopters were too loud, when gunfire swallowed words, when handlers needed obedience from a breath away, or 50 yards out. Walter straightened slowly. "You said you were just passing through." Nathan looked at him, then at Margaret, then at the line of shepherds eating in disciplined silence. "I thought I was," he said. Margaret rubbed Rosie's neck. "People think a lot of things before supper." Walter gave a rough huff that might have been a laugh in a younger man. "Question is, what do you think now?" Nathan did not answer, because he did not yet trust the answer. He walked toward Ranger instead. The old shepherd had finally gone to his bowl, but even while eating, he kept a slight angle on the lot, one eye on Nathan. Up close, his coat smelled of dust, old fur, liniment, and something else buried so deep it was almost imagination. Jet fuel, sea salt, canvas. Nathan swallowed hard. He crouched beside the dog, careful, neither reaching nor crowding. Ranger kept chewing, no growl, no warning, only awareness. Nathan let his gaze drift over the old collar again, but this time he did not touch it. "You know more than you should," he said softly, not sure whether he meant the dog or himself. Behind him, Walter said, "That one came to us half-starved and bleeding through his bandage. Never cried, never snapped. Just watched every door in the lot like he was waiting for a convoy." Nathan rose too quickly. "Who brought him?" Walter shook his head once. "No name. That's not possible. It is if a man leaves before sunrise." Nathan's jaw tightened. Margaret stood, using the van door for balance, subtle enough that a careless man might have missed it. "Some stories arrive without introductions," she said. "You can still tell they hurt." The generator hummed. The bowls scraped empty, one by one. Beyond the lot, the small Montana town settled into night. Nathan knew he should leave the questions alone until morning. He knew old people with guarded lives did not open because a stranger had military plates and a haunted face. But the years inside him had already begun to split open. He looked again at the dogs. One moved to the road. Two lay down. Rosie remained with Margaret. Shadow stationed himself where he could see both Walter and the van door. Ranger finished eating and returned. Not to the warmest spot, not to the nearest blanket, but to a place from which he could watch Nathan and the highway at the same time. Nothing about it was random. Nothing about any of them was random. Nathan's chest felt tight, almost bruised from the inside. At last he asked the one question that mattered most, though he suspected neither of them would answer it tonight. Walter did not. He only lifted the empty feed sack and said, "All I ever did was keep a promise." Then he turned away. Margaret lowered her eyes, and as Nathan stood under the weak light beside the old van and the 8 silent shepherds, Ranger looked up at him and, without a sound, obeyed the smallest motion of Nathan's hand. Nathan Brooks woke before sunrise, though he had barely slept. The Montana cold had crept into the cab of his truck sometime after midnight, settling in his knees and lower back like an old grudge, but the ache in his body was not what kept him from resting. It was the sound he had heard once, maybe twice, out in the RV lot. Not barking, not whining. The short, strangled cry of an old dog trapped in a dream too hard to escape. He had not gone out. That was the truth he disliked most by morning. At 58, Nathan still carried himself like a man trained to act before thinking had time to soften resolve. Yet age did not only weaken the body, it complicated the conscience. A younger man would have stepped into the dark, knelt beside the van, and decided on instinct what was needed. Nathan had stayed still, with his hands wrapped around cooling coffee inside the truck, staring through a fogged windshield, while a shepherd somewhere outside fought a war no one else could see. The sky was only beginning to pale when he stepped from the cab. Frost silvered the gravel. A weak seam of orange lay low over the fields beyond town. The lot was quiet, but not asleep. 2 of the shepherds were already up. One stood near the entrance road, broad-shouldered and motionless except for the slow turn of his head as a grain truck rumbled past on the highway. Another, the gaunt one that never liked to leave the road unguarded, was making a measured circuit of the fence line. Ranger sat near the step van, straight back despite his age, watching the dawn as if it owed him a report. Walter Harris was crouched beside a milk crate, sorting pill bottles and feed scoops. He wore the same faded flannel as the day before, and the old denim jacket hung from him, as though he had forgotten what it felt like to dress for comfort instead of necessity. His white beard caught the early light. Deep lines ran from nose to mouth, not from bitterness, but from years of clenching through weather, bills, and private worry. Margaret stood inside the van's open side door with a blanket over one arm and a kettle in hand. Her silver hair had loosened overnight, soft wisps escaping around her temples. In the thin morning light she looked smaller than ever, but there was no confusion in her face, no drifting slowness. Everything about her was alert, composed, practiced, the same woman who might have soothed a fevered child or buttoned shut a body bag with equal tenderness, because care, in some people, became a religion. "You stay?" Walter asked, not looking up. "Looks that way," Nathan said. Walter gave a short grunt that could have meant approval or resignation. Margaret offered Nathan a mug of coffee, as if he had been expected all along. "Still terrible," she said. He took it. "I'm beginning to trust the consistency." That earned him the faintest smile. The dogs were fed in near silence. Nathan watched again as patterns emerged. Shadow would not begin eating until Walter was within sight. Rosie stayed so close to Margaret's left side that the hem of the woman's coat brushed her shoulder. One shepherd with a pale scar across his chest drank water, then stood and turned 3 full circles, scanning the lot before lying down. Another old male, heavier through the ribs and slower to rise, positioned himself not at a bowl but beside the van's front wheel, where he could watch the open side door. No one had to tell Nathan what he was seeing now. It was too familiar. After breakfast, he made a decision he would have mocked in another man. He drove into town and started asking questions. The first place was the VFW Hall, a squat brick building with a flag out front and a hand-painted sign advertising Friday fish fry and Saturday bingo. It smelled of coffee, old wood, and lives that had narrowed but not quite dimmed. Veterans' halls always smelled that way, like tobacco that had seeped into the walls decades earlier, and stories that had never completely left. Behind the bar stood Earl Dugan, a retired Army sergeant in his 70s, with a bulldog jaw, thick white eyebrows, and hands the size of hammers. Earl's face had the hard folds of a man who had spent too many years pretending disappointment was the same thing as discipline. Yet when he spoke to the older men, shuffling in from the cold, there was gentleness in him too, crusted over but real. Nathan showed him nothing official at first. Just described the dogs, described the old couple, described a cracked collar, and a name that should have stayed buried. Earl's expression changed almost at once. "Aries," he said quietly. "Now that's a name I haven't heard in years." Nathan felt the room tilt a little. "You know it. Know of it." Earl lowered his voice. "More dogs than some counties had deputies. Search, tracking, cadaver, breach support. Heard they worked with units too busy to leave paper trails." Nathan did not confirm or deny. "What happened to the handlers?" Earl leaned one elbow on the bar. "Depends which one you mean." He began naming men. Caleb Dorn, dead of pancreatic cancer 3 winters ago. Luis Ortega, living outside Missoula last anyone knew, too proud for family, too broken for work. Ben Harker, Alzheimer's, in a care facility that no longer let him outside unsupervised. Terry Vale shot himself in a shed behind his brother's place after 3 years of nights he could not survive. David Rusk died in a highway wreck. John Pritchard, alive but vanished into the sort of homelessness that made men disappear while still breathing. Each name came down like a small hammer inside Nathan's chest. None of them were villains. None had simply abandoned anything. They had, one by one, been taken apart by time, illness, shame, memory, and the slow machinery of ordinary American collapse. Nathan wrote the names on the back of an old receipt with the pen Earl gave him. "Why does Walter Harris matter?" Nathan asked. Earl looked at him for a long moment, then shook his head. "Because when men stop answering, somebody has to." From the VFW, Nathan crossed town to the American Legion Hall, smaller and brighter, with a volunteer arranging donated canned goods near the door. There he found Marlene Fitch, a compact woman in her late 60s, with iron-gray hair cut short around a face sharp enough to slice through excuses. Her husband had served in Vietnam. After his death, she had made herself useful, the way some women made themselves indispensable, by remembering every widow, every medication, every hospital ride, every birthday no one else would have marked. Marlene listened without interrupting. Then she said, "Those dogs passed through grief the way old soldiers pass through weather." Quietly, with damage, Nathan looked down at his notes. "You're asking the wrong question," Marlene added. "Which question is that? Not where the dogs came from. You ought to be asking who kept handing them off when all the men started disappearing." Nathan let that settle. Marlene folded her arms. "I made 2 calls myself over the years. One to Walter, one to a vet in Helena. Walter always said yes first. The town veterinarian was his last stop before noon. Dr. Samuel Pike's clinic sat at the edge of town beside a feed store, a low building painted the color of old bone. Pike was in his late 60s, lean and stooped, with a long face, nicotine-yellowed fingers, and a patient, almost embarrassed kindness that belonged more often to country doctors than surgeons. He had treated ranch dogs, calving cows, lame horses, and old people's final companions for 40 years. His eyes were watery but keen. When Nathan described Ranger, Pike took off his glasses and cleaned them slowly. "You're talking about workers," he said, "not pets. I knew it the first time Walter brought one in. You treated them. Some what they'd let me." Pike gave a dry smile. "That lot of theirs has more dignity than many men, hard to sedate, harder to fool." He opened a metal filing cabinet and slid out a few old folders, weathered from use. None carried military insignia. None gave Nathan what he wanted most, but they held fragments, dates, approximate ages, weight loss, scar tissue, joint degeneration, old blast damage in one shoulder, hearing loss likely from repeated high-decibel exposure. Nathan read each note as if hoping the paper might accuse him directly and be done with it. Then Dr. Pike opened the last folder and paused. "This one came in with a transport tag, still clipped under the collar ring," he said. Nathan's eyes rose. "Which one?" "Ranger." The name hit with strange force. Nathan stepped closer. "What tag?" Pike shook his head. "Gone now. Walter burned it after reading it." "Why?" The old veterinarian met his gaze. "Because sometimes men think paperwork tells the truth. Walter doesn't." For a moment the room went still around Nathan. In the silence, memory rose sharp and unwanted. A conference room 9 years earlier. No windows. A polished table. Files stacked by category. Dogs moved from service into transition status. Handlers briefed. Units dissolved. Signatures required. Nathan had signed because he believed systems existed for a reason. Because after decades in uniform, he still thought stamped paper carried responsibility all the way to its rightful end. Because exhaustion makes cowards of practical men. He had signed 8 transfer authorizations that day. He could still see the line where his name went. At the time, he told himself the dogs would be rehomed through proper channels, monitored through approved partners, followed by people whose job it was to make sure no one was discarded. He had not checked later. That omission now felt heavier than any order he had ever followed. When he left the clinic, the noon light was thin and white. He sat in his truck outside the feed store with the heat running, and Pike's copied notes in his lap. His phone buzzed once with a spam call, once with a weather alert, and once with a message from an old number he had not erased. A man from his former unit, forwarding a notice about another memorial next month. Nathan stared at the screen, then turned the phone face down. Halfway through the drive back to the RV lot, he pulled over at a gas station and unfolded the receipt where he had written the names. 8 handlers, some dead, some lost in slower ways, some alive only in records and rumors, none positioned to keep a dog to old age. That truth hurt, but it was not the thing that hollowed him. What hollowed him was understanding that Walter Harris had become the end of a chain Nathan once believed would hold. By the time he returned to the lot, the sky had turned the pale iron color that promised snow later. The dogs noticed him before the people did. One lifted his head from beneath the van. Another moved away from the road to make room for his truck, as if they had already logged the sound of its engine into memory. Walter was replacing a cracked taillight lens on the step van. Margaret sat on a folding chair in the weak sun with Rosie against her legs and a tin of thread in her lap, mending a blanket seam. Nathan got out and stood for a moment without speaking. Walter glanced over. "Find what you were looking for?" Nathan looked at the old man's grease-marked hands, then at Margaret's bent silver head, then at the dogs spread in their silent positions, like the remains of some honorable army nobody had bothered to salute. "No," Nathan said. "I found what I failed to look for." Walter went still. Margaret raised her eyes. Nathan reached into the passenger seat and pulled out a flat, weathered document pouch he had not opened in years. He had kept it through 3 moves, 2 surgeries, and 1 divorce, telling himself he saved everything from service because that was what disciplined men did. The truth was uglier. He had kept it because some part of him knew one day he would have to answer to it. He opened the pouch on the hood of his truck. Inside were copied administrative records, transfer notices, discharge summaries, and the final dissolution packet for Aries' team. His hands were steady only because he forced them to be. He found the page he dreaded most and laid it flat beneath the gray afternoon light. There they were, 8 signatures, 8 transfer lines, his own name at the bottom authorizing the process. Nathan stared at the page until the words blurred. When he finally looked up, Walter was watching him with the weary expression of a man who had long ago stopped being surprised by how late truth arrived. "Now you know," Walter said. Nathan swallowed once, hard, but the question inside him had only sharpened. He looked from the page to Walter Harris and asked in a voice quieter than before, quieter because it mattered more. "Who was the first man who called you?" Walter Harris did not answer right away. The afternoon had turned colder, while Nathan stood with the old records spread across the hood of his truck. A hard wind moved across the RV lot, carrying the smell of dry grass, metal, and the faint medicinal scent that always clung to the step van. Behind them, one of the shepherds shifted in his sleep and let out a rough breath. The sound was small, but in the silence after Nathan's question, it seemed to belong to something much larger than a dog dreaming. "Who was the first man who called you?" Walter lowered his eyes to the gravel, as if the answer were not in his memory, but under his boots somewhere, buried among oil stains and the years. His shoulders, still wiry beneath the old denim jacket, seemed to sink, not with weakness, but with the weight of being the last man left, holding a story too long. Margaret did not speak either. She sat near the side door of the van, with Rosie pressed against her knees, one hand resting absently on the dog's neck. The hand trembled once, almost invisibly, then stilled. Nathan saw it. He had been seeing it more often. The slight shake when she unscrewed a pill bottle. The pause before lifting a kettle. The way her left hand sometimes seemed to think a second slower than the rest of her body. But Margaret noticed his noticing and gave him that same small smile she had used before, the smile of women who had spent their lives turning pain into courtesy. "Just age," she said softly. Nathan did not challenge her. Not then. Walter finally reached down, folded the document packet shut with calloused fingers, and handed it back to Nathan. "The first one wasn't a handler," he said. Nathan frowned. "Then who was he?" Walter looked up at him. He was a son. The wind pressed at the loose flap of the van's side curtain. Somewhere down the road, a pickup passed too fast over a pothole and sent a hollow clatter back across the lot. None of the dogs reacted. They had heard worse things in other places. Nathan stood very still. Walter turned and crossed the gravel toward the step van. "Come on," he muttered. "Too cold to tell hard things outside." Inside, the van was warmer than Nathan expected. Not comfortable exactly, but organized with the careful intelligence of people who had learned to survive without wasting movement. A narrow cot ran along one wall. Folded blankets were stacked above a small cabinet. A propane stove sat bolted into a counter beside a plastic dish rack and a row of labeled medicine bottles. Leashes hung on hooks in a neat line. At the back was a curtain drawn across what must have been the sleeping area. The place smelled of coffee, wool, antiseptic, and old dog fur. It smelled, strangely, like devotion. Walter sat on a metal stool and leaned his elbows on his knees. Up close in the dim light, Nathan could see the old mechanic's face more clearly than before. The deep lines, the gray eyes still sharp beneath heavy lids, the scar along one wrist where skin had once torn and healed badly. Walter was not an expressive man, but grief had a way of making landmarks out of ordinary features. His name was Daniel Mercer, Walter said. Nathan inhaled sharply. The name struck him with the clean force of a blow. Daniel Mercer had been the son of Owen Mercer, one of Nathan's closest teammates before retirement, a man who had laughed too loud, prayed too seldom, and once dragged Nathan half-conscious through a blown doorway in Kandahar. Owen had died years ago from heart failure. Nathan had attended the funeral. Daniel had stood in the front pew with his mother, jaw locked, not yet 30, trying to resemble the kind of son a soldier would have wanted. Nathan remembered him now in fragments, tall, lean, dark blonde hair, the Mercer jawline, all clean corners and stubbornness. "Daniel?" Nathan said. "Owen's boy?" Walter nodded once. Margaret's eyes lowered to Rosie's ears as her fingers continued their slow stroking. The dog looked up at her with solemn attention, as if she too knew this story by heart. Nathan sat on the edge of the opposite bench without meaning to. The old van creaked softly around him. "He came here 10 years ago," Walter said. "Not in uniform, not as a soldier, just a tired man with too much fear in his face." Walter's voice changed when he began to speak of the past, not softer exactly, more deliberate, like a man stepping carefully across rotten boards. He drove in at dusk with a shepherd in the back of a borrowed SUV. Dog was half skin and old scars, ribs sharp as roof slats. Wouldn't look at him, wouldn't look at us either, just watched the mirrors. Nathan swallowed. "Daniel asked if I was Walter Harris," Walter continued. "I said yes. He told me Earl Dugan sent him. Said I was the kind of man who fixed engines and minded his own business. I told him Earl talked too much. That might have been a joke once, but it did not rise high enough to become one. He looked bad," Margaret said quietly. "Thin in the face. Eyes too bright, the kind of bright sick people get when they're trying not to frighten everybody else." Nathan turned to her. She met his eyes only briefly, then looked away. "I was a nurse for 35 years, she said. "I knew before he told us." Walter rubbed his palms together, staring at the floor between his boots. "Pancreatic cancer," he said. Stage 4. Chemo had bought him months, not years. He had no wife, no children. His mother was already gone by then. He said there were calls he couldn't make because nobody would answer, and calls he wouldn't make because the men on the other end had already buried too much. Nathan closed his eyes for a moment. Daniel had called him once, years back. Nathan remembered that suddenly with terrible clarity. An unknown number, a voicemail he had listened to in an airport while hurrying to another obligation. Daniel had sounded nervous, almost embarrassed. He had asked if Nathan might call back when convenient. Nathan never had, At the time it had seemed small, one call among too many things. A man tells himself life is long, and that unfinished gestures can be completed later. He opened his eyes again, and the inside of the van felt tighter. "What did he want from you?" Nathan asked. Walter answered by looking at Margaret. The old couple shared one of those glances made possible only by decades together, the kind in which memory, fatigue, and agreement pass back and forth without the burden of words. Then Walter said it. He wanted one thing. Nathan waited. Walter's eyes moved toward the window where Ranger's shadow passed briefly across the frosted glass outside. He said, "If one day there's nobody left to answer for them, please don't let them die alone." The sentence seemed to remain in the van after Walter finished speaking, hanging there with the steam from the kettle and the slow ticking of cooling metal. Nathan felt his chest cave inward around it. He had heard desperate requests before. Men in war made all kinds of promises when pain came near enough. But this did not sound like battlefield panic. It sounded worse. It sounded like a dying man who had already looked at the world and judged it unreliable. Margaret stood to refill the kettle. Her movement was steady at first, then not. As she reached for the tin of tea, her fingers fluttered and struck the lid sideways. It clattered against the counter and spun once before falling. Rosie was up instantly. So was Ranger outside. Nathan heard the scrape of claws, then saw the old shepherd's face appear at the lower edge of the door window, ears raised, body tense, not aggressive, but alert in a way that made the moment feel watched by more than the three people inside it. Margaret froze. For one heartbeat her expression changed, not embarrassment, not irritation, fear. Then it vanished, smoothed away beneath composure, so practiced it might have fooled anyone who had not spent years around wounded men pretending to be functional. Walter rose without a word, picked up the fallen lid, and set it back on the counter. He did not touch his wife. He did not ask if she was all right. He simply stood close enough that his nearness itself became an act of assistance. Nathan's stomach tightened. That was not the choreography of a new problem. That was an old one. Margaret drew in a breath, flexed her fingers once, and gave a little laugh too light to be natural. Arthritis enjoys an audience. No one answered. Outside the door, Ranger remained where he was, eyes fixed not on Nathan, not on Walter, but on Margaret. The old dog seemed to know more than any of them were saying. Walter resumed his seat only after Margaret had lowered herself back onto the bench. "Daniel left Ranger with us that first night," he said, as if the interruption had not happened. "Said he'd come back with papers in a week." "But he didn't," Nathan said. Walter shook his head. "No. He came back 2 days later looking worse, could barely get out of the truck. Brought a folder, some meds, one worn-out leash, and a list of names written by hand." Nathan leaned forward. "What names?" "The dogs, the handlers, sometimes a last known number, sometimes just a town and a church or a VFW post." Walter's mouth tightened. He said he'd been trying to track what happened after the team was scattered. Said the dogs were aging faster than the men could handle. Some handlers were already sick, some drinking, some gone in the head. He'd managed to locate one dog, then another, not by some grand plan, just by refusing to stop. Nathan stared at him. Daniel Mercer, not a handler, not under orders, just a dying son carrying responsibility his father had once shouldered beside other men. "Why you?" Nathan asked, though he already knew part of the answer. Walter shrugged. "Because Earl knew me, because Margaret had room in her heart if not in the van, because I was stupid enough to say yes." Margaret smiled faintly at that. "You were kind enough." Walter ignored the correction. "He made me promise," he said. Not forever. He wasn't foolish. He just said until somebody better came, somebody who understood what they were. somebody who wouldn't chain them in a yard or hand them to a shelter and call it mercy. Nathan could not speak for a few seconds. The kettle began to hum on the burner. Outside, one of the dogs barked once at something on the road, and another answered from farther back with a lower note, more acknowledgement than alarm. "How many did Daniel bring himself?" Nathan asked at last. "Only Ranger," Walter said. "But after he died, the list stayed, and the phone number he wrote on the back of it was mine. Somehow that number kept traveling, widow to widow, vet to vet, shelter to shelter, one old soldier to another." He looked down at his hands. "Every time somebody called, I heard the same thing in different words. 'Can you take one more?'" Nathan's throat burned. And every time, apparently, Walter had said yes. He looked toward Margaret again. Her face had gone pale with fatigue, though she still sat upright, one hand on Rosie's shoulders. There was stubbornness in her too, but a quieter kind than Walter's. Walter was flint. Margaret was thread, same endurance. "I should known," Nathan said. Walter lifted his eyes. "Maybe." The bluntness of it hurt because it was honest. Nathan nodded once. "No, not maybe." The van had grown very still. Even the burner flame seemed quieter. Walter reached into a drawer beside the cot and brought out an envelope, yellowed with age and soft at the edges from having been handled too often. He set it on the table between them. "Daniel left this too," he said. "Said not to open it unless there came a day some man with the right ghosts in his face finally asked the right question." Nathan stared at the envelope. His name was not written on it. There was no military insignia, no address, no note on the outside at all. Just plain paper holding 10 years of silence. Nathan did not reach for it immediately. Across from him, Margaret shifted, and a small orange bottle slipped from her lap, bounced once on the bench, and fell to the floor with a plastic rattle. This time nobody moved quickly enough to hide it. Nathan bent first. The label turned upward in his hand under the dim, overhead light. He read the word once. Parkinson's. He looked up slowly. Margaret had gone very still. Walter closed his eyes. For a long moment, nobody in the van pretended any more. Nathan set the bottle gently on the table beside Daniel Mercer's envelope. Outside, Ranger scratched once at the metal step and waited. Inside, Nathan felt another truth opening beneath the first, and he understood, all at once, that the promise Walter had been keeping was no longer the only one running out of time. Nathan Brooks did not open Daniel Mercer's envelope that night. He carried it back to his truck and left it on the passenger's seat, where it seemed to gather weight in the dark like a living thing. Some truths had a way of changing shape once read. He understood that now. For years he had imagined guilt as something sharp and immediate, a blow, a gunshot, an order that came too late. But this was different. This was guilt with roots. It had grown quietly beneath the floorboards of his life, under routines and excuses, and the respectable lie that systems would take care of what men were too tired to face. The bottle of Parkinson's medicine haunted him, more than the unopened envelope. So did the look on Margaret's face when he saw it. Not shame, not exactly, something sadder than that. The look of a woman who had known for some time that the body was beginning its slow betrayal and had decided, with private dignity, not to make it anyone else's problem for as long as she could help it. By morning, thin snow had begun to drift over the RV lot, softening the gravel and the wheel ruts and the old stains beneath the van. Nathan climbed down from his truck with stiffness in his joints, and Daniel's envelope still unopened in his coat pocket. The dogs were already awake. Ranger stood near the step van, head high, watching the lot through the faint white swirl. Shadow had taken position at the road. Rosie stayed close to Margaret, who was carrying a metal bowl of soaked kibble and medicine tablets with both hands, Careful now, too careful. Walter was scraping a thin layer of ice from the step with a flat shovel. Nathan walked straight to him. "Let me take them," he said. Walter did not look up. "Morning to you, too. I mean it. I know you do." Nathan took another step closer. "I have land. I've got a cabin outside Bozeman, fenced acreage, room enough to separate the ones that need space. I can bring in a vet. I can build proper runs, heated flooring, whatever they need. You and Margaret shouldn't be carrying this alone." Walter leaned on the shovel and finally turned. In the cold daylight, his face looked older than it had inside the van, the skin around his eyes cut fine by weather and sleeplessness, but the old man's gaze had not softened. "You think I'm refusing because I don't trust you?" he asked. Nathan opened his mouth, then closed it. Walter tapped the edge of the shovel against the packed snow once, a quiet sound like a thought being set down carefully. "I'm refusing because they know this place," he said. "They know this van. They know our voices, our habits, our smells, our footsteps at night. Old dogs don't measure safety the way young men do. They don't hear opportunity. They hear change." Nathan said nothing. Walter's voice stayed level, but something raw moved beneath it now. "You load them all into trucks, move them to somewhere cleaner, bigger, better, and maybe in your mind you're saving them. But inside those old bones, inside those old heads, maybe all they know is they're being sent away again." The words landed harder than Nathan wanted them to. He looked past Walter toward Ranger, toward the other shepherds, spread through the snow like weathered guardians. Old age had taken speed from them, strength from them, hearing from some, sight from others, but it had not taken memory, and memory, Nathan knew too well, could be crueler than pain. Margaret came down the step carefully, Rosie at her knees. The older woman's cheeks were pink from cold, her silver hair tucked under a knitted cap now, her mouth set with that familiar softness that somehow never weakened into fragility. "Walter is being ruder than necessary," she said. "He's being honest," Nathan replied. "That too." She handed Walter the bowl, and he began portioning the softened food into smaller dishes. As always, the dogs waited in disciplined stillness until the routine settled. Nathan noticed one of the older males, Duke, shifting more slowly than before. Duke was thick through the shoulders, 12 years old at least, with a broad skull, a frost-white muzzle, and a scar running like a pale seam across the center of his chest. He had the look of a dog who had once hit doors or debris head first because someone had to go first. This morning, however, he lowered himself with visible effort. Nathan filed the detail away without knowing why it troubled him so much. By noon, the weather had driven half the town indoors, but small places carried news the way dry grass carried flame. Linda from the Red Vest returned with 2 bags of anti-inflammatory medicine and a bundle of wool blankets. She brought, without being asked, a younger woman Nathan had never seen before. The newcomer was in her early 30s, tall and narrow through the hips and shoulders, with chestnut hair pulled into a loose knot that looked as if it had been redone several times with one distracted hand. Her face was fine-boned and pale from winter, her eyes quick and amber-brown behind wire-rimmed glasses. She wore a green parka, snow-dusted boots, and the alert expression of someone who had trained herself to look interested before deciding whether to care. A small camera hung at her side. "This is Claire Donnelly," Linda announced. "She writes for the county paper." Claire dipped her head politely. "I also run the website nobody over 60 claims to read." Walter grunted. Claire's mouth twitched. "That was a joke, Mr. Harris." Mostly, she did not have the scavenging air Nathan disliked in some reporters. There was curiosity in her, yes, but not hunger. More than anything, she looked tired in the particular way local journalists often did. Underpaid, overworked, and still vulnerable to human stories despite knowing better. "I heard a little about the dogs," Claire said. "Only what Linda told me. I don't want to intrude. But this town cares about veterans, and it cares about animals. And frankly, it's a wonder no one's told this story properly before." Walter's expression darkened. "Stories bring strangers. Sometimes they also bring medicine," Margaret said quietly. Walter looked at her, then away. Nathan watched the whole exchange and kept still. He knew when a family argument was old enough to have become weather. Claire spent an hour in the lot, but she worked differently than Nathan expected. She asked permission. Before taking a single photo, she crouched low so the dogs could see her face. She let Rosie sniff the back of her glove before coming any closer. When Ranger refused her lens, she lowered the camera at once. She asked Walter no pitying questions. She asked Margaret what each blanket was for. She asked Nathan only one thing. Nathan considered lying, then found he was too tired. "Because I should come sooner," he said. Claire held his gaze for a moment, and something in her expression changed. Whatever she had expected, it was not that. By late afternoon, the story was online. Nathan knew because Linda's nephew drove by honking and waving his phone out the truck window, as if the internet itself were a parade. Within an hour, the first strangers arrived. A ranch couple left 3 bags of senior dog food. A church deacon dropped off quilts. A teenager in a feed store apron brought joint supplements with his own money and fled before anyone could thank him. Then came the envelopes. Money tucked under windshield wipers, cash inside sympathy cards, checks in neat handwriting from people who had never before stepped into the RV lot. Walter returned almost all of it. Nathan watched him do it with stubborn, methodical refusal. He placed every envelope in a cardboard box on the van's counter, wrote names on the outside where he could, and sent them back through Claire, Linda, or anyone else he trusted. He kept only what could be used immediately and specifically: medicine, food, blankets, heating pads, a replacement battery for the van, 1 voucher from Dr. Pike for emergency care. By evening, Nathan's patience thinned. He found Walter outside stacking the donated blankets in plastic bins against the falling snow. The old mechanic's shoulders were hunched from cold and fatigue, but he kept moving. "You're turning away help," Nathan said. Walter did not stop stacking. "I'm turning away cash. That's help. Sometimes." Nathan took a breath and tried again. "You need it." Walter set down the blankets and straightened slowly. Snow clung to the brim of his cap and melted into his beard. "No," he said. "We need things. There's a difference." Nathan frowned. "What difference?" Walter looked toward the dogs. The lot was almost blue with evening now. Duke had curled beside the generator housing. Shadow remained at his post by the road despite the cold. Rosie watched Margaret through the van doorway. Ranger sat under the weak porch light, snow collecting on his back without his noticing. Walter's voice, when it came, was roughened by something deeper than exhaustion. "Money makes people feel done," he said. "They hand it over, feel decent, go home warm, and tell themselves the lonely have been fixed." He rubbed a hand once over his jaw. "But money doesn't sit awake through thunder with an old dog that can't remember which war it's in. Money doesn't hear the nails on the floor at 2 in the morning and know which one needs water and which one needs a hand on his neck. Money doesn't keep you from becoming the last creature in the room." Nathan felt the words strike the hardest place in him, because he knew he had spent years sending the emotional equivalent of money into other corners of his life. A donation here, a card there, a practical excuse, anything but the whole of himself. Walter bent to pick up another blanket. Then, without warning, Nathan's throat closed. It was not graceful, it was not cinematic, no noble single tear, just a sudden crack inside him that years of posture and training could not contain. He turned his face away, but it was too late. The first sob came out like a breath he had been holding since retirement. Walter stilled. Margaret, from the van doorway, did not speak. She did not move toward him either. Some griefs are insulted by comfort before they are finished arriving. Nathan pressed the heel of his hand to his eyes and hated himself for the weakness, then hated himself more for still thinking of it as weakness. "I signed them away," he said hoarsely. "I signed the papers and walked off like it was handled." Snow whispered down between them. Walter's reply was quiet. "Then stay now. It was not forgiveness. Not yet, but it was not exile." Nathan nodded once, unable to answer. Darkness came early after that. Claire returned with 2 more boxes of donated supplies and a thermos of stew from the church basement kitchen. Linda came back with batteries and an old electric throw blanket. Even strangers moved more softly now, as if the story had changed shape in town from curiosity to responsibility. Nathan helped carry things inside, fixed a loose latch on the van's rear cabinet, and checked Duke again as the old dog rose stiffly to shift positions. Duke's breathing was wrong. Not dramatic at first, just shallower than it should have been, with a strange hesitation at the end of each exhale. Nathan crouched and laid a hand near the dog's ribs. Duke accepted the touch without tension, but his sides worked harder than before. His gums looked pale in the porch light. "Walter," Nathan called. The old man came out of the van, took one look, and dropped instantly to one knee. All hardness left his face. Margaret was beside them a second later, Rosie pushing anxiously against her legs. Duke tried to stand. His front legs managed it. Then something failed. The big shepherd's body shuddered once, and he collapsed onto the gravel with a heavy, awful finality that made every other dog in the lot rise at once. No barking, just stillness, a ring of old soldiers around one fallen body. Walter's hand went to Duke's neck. Margaret whispered the dog's name. Nathan reached for his phone to call Dr. Pike, but for one frozen second even, he could not feel his own fingers. In the blue-white hush of the snowy lot, with the other shepherds standing watch, and Duke unmoving at their center, only one thought cut through Nathan's mind with terrible clarity. He did not yet know whether the old dog would live. For one suspended second after Duke fell, no one in the lot seemed to breathe. The snow kept drifting down in slow white threads, settling over the old dog's backs and the roof of the step van and Walter's bent shoulders. Duke lay on the gravel where he had collapsed, his large body awkwardly folded, his chest moving in shallow bursts. Ranger had already reached him. The old shepherd stood over Duke's neck and shoulders, not touching, not panicking, simply holding position with the rigid vigilance of a sentry who refused to abandon a wounded man. "Call Pike," Walter said. Nathan already had the phone to his ear. Dr. Samuel Pike arrived 15 minutes later in a rust-specked pickup with a magnetic veterinary placard slapped crooked across the door. He came out of the cab in a canvas coat and wool gloves, moving faster than a man his age ought to in the cold. In the harsh porch light, his long, weathered face looked sharper than Nathan remembered, his eyes alert despite the late hour. Country veterinarians often carried the same look combat medics did, fatigue worn openly, tenderness concealed in efficiency. He knelt beside Duke without wasting a word. Margaret held a flashlight steady. Walter kept one hand near Duke's shoulder, not restraining, only anchoring. Pike listened to the dog's chest, checked the gums, and frowned. "Not a seizure," he muttered. "More likely a syncopal spell. Heart or age-related collapse. He's still with us." Nathan exhaled for what felt like the first time in minutes. Pike prepared an injection to stabilize the old shepherd and asked for blankets. Claire's donated quilts were brought out. As Walter and Nathan eased Duke onto one of them, Ranger took one step backward and only one, as if granting the medic's room while refusing to surrender the perimeter entirely. Then, while Duke was being lifted into the back of Dr. Pike's pickup for observation at the clinic, Ranger stumbled. It was subtle at first, a sway no one would have noticed in a younger dog, but Nathan saw it at once. Ranger's hindquarters dropped hard. His breath came too fast. He tried to straighten and failed. "Ranger," Nathan said, already moving. The shepherd looked up at him, amber eyes suddenly clouded by pain Nathan had not seen there before. For the first time since Nathan had arrived in the lot, Ranger did not try to hide the weakness in his body. Dr. Pike turned. His face tightened the moment he saw the dog's stance. "Him too," he said. Within minutes, both dogs were loaded into the truck bed on quilts, Duke motionless but stable, Ranger trembling and unable to settle. Nathan climbed into the back beside them without asking permission. The metal floor was freezing through his pants, but he barely felt it. As the truck jolted onto the road, Pike called back over the roar of the heater, "Keep Ranger upright if you can. He's compensating for something. Could be pain, could be internal pressure, could be his lungs. Hard to tell until I get him under light sedation." Nathan slid one arm beneath Ranger's chest. The old shepherd was heavier than he looked, all bone, scar tissue, and loyalty. Ranger leaned against him for half a second, then steadied. Duke beside them gave a rough exhale and remained still. Snow blurred the highway lights into halos. Nathan had been in worse transports. That thought arrived uninvited and stayed. There had been men bleeding on metal floors before. Dogs too. Engines too loud for prayer. Time measured in breaths and triage decisions. Strange how the body remembered old fear before the mind put words to it. At the clinic, they brought Duke into one exam room and Ranger into another. Nathan followed Ranger. The exam room was small and too bright, smelling of antiseptic, iodine, and warm circuitry. Ranger stood only because Nathan and Pike helped him. Under the fluorescent light, the old scars showed more clearly than ever. The healed line above the eye, the left shoulder seam, the frayed edges of a body that had spent years carrying commands as if they were muscle. Pike worked quickly. He listened, palpated, drew blood, then ordered an X-ray from his sleepy technician, a young woman named Tess Monroe, who arrived in mismatched winter boots and a faded college sweatshirt under her clinic scrubs. Tess was in her mid-20s, tall and pale with freckles dusted across a narrow nose, auburn hair braided over one shoulder, and the grave, competent calm of people who had loved animals long enough to stop making a performance of it. She spoke softly to Ranger, not in baby talk but in clean, respectful tones, and when she touched his muzzle, he did not resist. After the images came up on the monitor, Pike stared too long. Nathan knew that look. "How bad?" he asked. The vet took off his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "Severe degeneration in the hips. Old trauma, plenty of it. Likely chronic pain for years. But that's not what dropped him tonight." He tapped the screen once. "His chest is rough, scarring. Could be old blast lung damage. Could be repeated exposure. Tonight's stress probably tipped him. He's not dying this minute, but he's living close to the edge." Nathan looked at Ranger, now sedated enough to rest his head on folded paws. "How much time?" he asked. Pike was too honest to lie well. Not enough for anybody to keep pretending he's just an old dog who needs rest. The words entered Nathan quietly, and did their damage anyway. Duke, it turned out, had suffered a fainting spell linked to age and probable cardiac weakness. Pike stabilized him, gave strict instructions, and said he could return to the lot if kept warm and watched through the night. Ranger, however, needed monitoring longer. His breathing settled after medication, but every rise and fall of his ribs looked hard-earned. Walter refused to leave the clinic waiting room at first. Margaret sat beside him with both hands clasped around a paper cup of tea she had long stopped drinking. The overhead lights made her skin look almost translucent. Nathan stepped out to tell them what Pike had said. Walter listened without interrupting. His face did not crack. It simply seemed to lose some private reserve of strength. Margaret closed her eyes. "Not much time," she repeated softly. Nathan nodded. She was silent for a few moments, then asked, "Can he come back with us tonight?" "He can," Pike said from the doorway. "If someone stays awake." Walter rose at once. "I'll do it." But Margaret's gaze moved from the old mechanic to Nathan, and what passed through her eyes then was not a request exactly. It was recognition. She had seen something break open in Nathan over the past 2 days. Perhaps she understood before he did that some men only begin to belong to a place once they are needed there at night. Back at the RV lot, Duke was settled under layers of blankets near the generator housing. Shadow took up position a little closer than usual, as though silent company might help the old male hold on. The other shepherds adjusted themselves around the lot with the grave awareness of animals who knew, in whatever way animals know, that something in the order of their world had shifted. Ranger was brought into the van and laid on a thick quilt beside the cot. Nathan stayed. It was the first time in 10 years he had slept, or tried to sleep, inside a vehicle, not because he had to, but because somebody else needed him there. The step van changed shape at night. In daylight it was a shelter, a moving home held together by discipline. In darkness it became something more exposed. The walls creaked with wind. Every breath seemed louder. Every paw scrape, every rattle of tags, every cough mattered. Nathan sat on the floor beside Ranger, while Walter took the first hour by the stove, and Margaret rested with Rosie curled against her feet. The old female shepherd slept lightly, waking every few minutes to look at Margaret's hands. Outside the storm passed. Then came silence. Then came the dreams. It began with a low whine from Shadow, out in the lot. Not loud, just raw enough to pull the nerves taut. Another dog answered with a sharp breath. Then one of the shepherds struck the side of the van from outside, with a sudden force that made Margaret flinch awake. Walter was already on his feet. Nathan slid the door open and stepped into the cold. The lot had gone silver beneath the moon and fresh snow. Shadow stood rigid near the road, barking at nothing visible, ears pinned, eyes huge. Across from him, the pale-coated dog scout had sprung up from sleep and was braced in front of the van door, body angled to block entry. Near the rear wheel, Ghost, the gaunt male, was spinning once, twice, then stopping to stare upward into the dark, as if listening for rotors no one else could hear. No one had told Nathan which dog feared what. Now he knew. Not as facts, as hauntings. He moved first to Shadow, speaking quietly until the old shepherd's bark thinned into breath. Walter got Scout to back off the van door with a palm on the neck and a murmured command. Margaret, inside, began humming under her breath, some church tune or lullaby too old to place. Rosie rested her chin on the woman's knee, as if lending weight to the song. Ghost stood trembling in the open snow, eyes still raised toward the empty sky. Nathan went to him last. Ghost was around 12, narrow as hunger, black-faced with a fine-boned muzzle, and a gait so light he often seemed more shadow than dog. Tonight he was all terror. Nathan crouched slowly and laid a hand between the old shepherd's shoulders. "There's nothing up there now," he said, but the words were as much for himself as for the dog. It took nearly an hour to settle them all. By the time Nathan came back inside, his own hands were shaking. Margaret noticed. "Now you see it," she said. He sat opposite her on the floor, Ranger sleeping between them, and nodded. "I thought I understood." "No," she said. "You understood war. This is the war after." The sentence hung in the dim van, lit only by the stove glow and a battery lantern on low. For a while neither of them spoke. Walter had gone out again to check Duke. Rosie had finally slept. Ranger's breathing remained shallow but steady. Then Margaret said, very quietly, "I know I won't be able to do this much longer." Nathan lifted his eyes. She looked toward her own hands, resting in her lap now without disguise. In the soft light, the tremor showed plainly. "I am not afraid of dying," she said. "Not in the way people assume. Old nurses don't get that luxury." A sad smile touched her mouth. "What I'm afraid of is dropping a medicine cup and having no one left who knows which dog can't take pills wrapped in cheese and which one won't swallow unless Walter stands in the doorway. I'm afraid of a night like this one, when my hands won't answer me fast enough." Nathan listened, without moving. She drew in a breath. "Walter thinks he is carrying all of this for me. Truth is, I've been lying to him too. I've known for months." Nathan glanced at Ranger, then back to her. "When were you going to tell him?" "When he got too tired to keep pretending not to know." There was tenderness in that answer, so deep it hurt. The van door opened. Walter stepped back in, snow dusting his shoulders. His face was pale with cold and worry, but his eyes were clear. "Duke's sleeping," he said. For now. He looked from Margaret to Nathan and sensed at once that something important had passed between them. No one explained it. Nathan rose slowly. "If you'll let me," he said, voice steady, now in a way it had not been before. "I'll keep the promise." Walter said nothing. Nathan went on because silence was no longer an excuse. "I can't fix the years behind us. I can't undo what I signed. But if you both say yes, I'll stay with this. With them. However long it takes. However long they've got. However long you need." Walter stood with one hand still on the doorframe. His face did not soften, and that somehow made the moment more real. Margaret's eyes filled, though she did not cry. Walter looked at Ranger on the quilt, at Rosie beside Margaret, at Nathan standing in the cramped heat of the van, as if asking for orders and forgiveness in the same breath. Then he lowered his gaze. He did not answer. Sometime near dawn, after the dogs had finally settled and the stove burned down to its faintest hiss, Nathan dozed in a chair by the door. When he woke, the van was blue with early morning light. Ranger was still asleep. Margaret was still on the cot. Walter was gone, so were his boots. Nathan Brooks knew Walter Harris had not run away. The moment he saw the empty place by the stove, the missing boots, and the quiet shape of Margaret still sleeping beneath the folded blanket, he understood that much. Walter was not the kind of man who fled hard things. He was the kind who walked toward them without announcing it, because that was how older men survived the parts of life that would have made younger men dramatic. Still, the step van felt wrong without him. Ranger remained stretched on the quilt, breathing shallow but steady in the low blue light of dawn. Rosie had taken up her place beside Margaret's cot. Outside, the rest of the old shepherds were beginning to stir, their movements slow with cold and age, but familiar enough now that Nathan felt the order of them before he fully saw it. Shadow by the road, Scout near the door, Ghost already drifting toward the fence line like a dark thought. Duke, alive, wrapped in blankets under the generator housing, lifting his head with the exhausted dignity of a soldier who had made it through one more night. Nathan stepped out into the morning in Walter's borrowed silence. Snow covered the lot in a clean skin, making everything look gentler than it was. The sky had the pale, iron-white color of a day that would never quite warm. He walked the perimeter once without thinking, checking on each dog with the instinctive rhythm of a man slipping back into a role he had once known so well that his body remembered it before his pride could object. Margaret woke while he was bringing fresh water to Duke. She came carefully down the step-van stairs, one hand braced on the rail, the other curled into her coat sleeve against the tremor she no longer bothered to fully hide. Her silver hair had escaped its knot, softening her face. Without Walter beside her, she seemed, for the first time, every one of her years. "He went to town?" Nathan asked. Margaret studied him for a second, and then shook her head. "Further than town." Nathan waited. There was something almost tender in the way she looked toward the road, as if she could see a destination from habit alone. "He only goes there when something inside him has decided before the rest of him can argue," she said. "Where?" Margaret answered with the kind of simplicity that makes grief sharper. "The Veterans' Cemetery." Nathan stood very still. A little wind crossed the lot, carrying the smell of snow, wet wool, and the faint mineral scent of cold metal. Behind them, Ranger lifted his head from the quilt inside the van and gave one low breath through his nose, as if the old dog had understood the name of a place he had never seen. Margaret wrapped her coat tighter. "Walter won't like that, I told you. Do you want me to go after him?" She looked down at her hands for a moment. "No," she said softly. "I want you to go to him." The cemetery lay on a low rise outside town, where the land opened wide and quiet beneath the sky. Nathan drove there in his truck, the heater rattling uselessly against the cold. He had been to enough military burials to know the geography before he arrived. Flagpole, gravel lane, white stones standing in disciplined rows, the silence of people who had already done all their speaking. Walter's pickup was parked near the far edge. Nathan found him standing before a grave, marked with a simple white headstone, half-rimmed in frost. Walter had taken off his cap. His white hair moved in the wind. From behind, he looked smaller than Nathan remembered, not because the man himself had changed overnight, but because sorrow had finally been given enough open ground to show its true scale. Nathan stopped a respectful distance away. Walter did not turn. For a while neither man spoke. The cemetery had its own kind of order, like the dogs back in the lot. Rows, duty, silence, positions held. Then Nathan read the headstone. Daniel Mercer, beloved son, beloved friend gone too. Soon the dates beneath the name made the loss indecently young. Nathan drew a slow breath. Walter's voice came out roughened by cold and old restraint. "I told him I'd come by when the time was right." Nathan looked from the stone to the old man's rigid shoulders. "To say what now?" Walter turned. His eyes were red, though not wet. He was not a man who cried easily. Perhaps that was why grief had chosen to carve itself so deeply into the rest of him. "To say I found the next one," he replied. Nathan felt the words hit somewhere behind his ribs. Walter looked back at the grave. "Daniel used to stand right where you are. First few times after we buried him, he'd talk out loud like the dead were simply late to answer, told his father every little thing, what Ranger had eaten, which dog had snapped at which vet, whether the van battery was dying. I used to think it was foolish." He paused. "Then one day I found myself doing it too." Nathan lowered his eyes. The wind moved through the cemetery grass with a dry whisper. Walter rubbed his thumb over the brim of his cap. "I never saved those dogs," he said. "That's the part everybody gets wrong. Folks in town want a story with heroes because it lets them sleep better. Old man and old woman take in broken war dogs. Makes for a neat little miracle." His jaw tightened. "But it wasn't like that." "No?" Nathan asked quietly. Walter shook his head. "When Daniel brought Ranger, Margaret and I were half dead already, not in the body, in the soul." He gave a humorless breath. "We had buried our own son years before. Different war, different uniform. Same folded flag. After that, the world kept asking us to continue like ordinary people. Go to church, pay taxes, smile at neighbors. But grief doesn't make you decent. Sometimes it just makes you empty. Nathan listened without moving. There was a night, Walter went on, voice lowering, when Margaret and I sat in that van with the engine running and the door shut. We didn't have some grand plan, just no more appetite for tomorrow. Nathan felt the cold sharpen all over his skin. Walter stared at Daniel's grave, but his eyes were seeing elsewhere now. Ranger was in the back then. First week with us. Too thin. Wouldn't sleep. Wouldn't trust. We thought he was resting. Walter's mouth trembled once before he mastered it. He came forward between the seats and put his head in Margaret's lap. Didn't lick her. Didn't whine. Just laid the weight of himself there like a command. Nathan closed his eyes briefly. Then he looked at me, Walter said, not like a dog, like a man who had lost too much and was asking whether I meant to leave him too. The wind shifted. A flag rope tapped against the pole in the distance. Walter's next words came so softly, Nathan almost missed them. So no, I didn't save him. He interrupted something terrible. Then the others came, one by one, and before we knew it, our days had shape again. Medicine times, feeding times, vet calls, repairs, night checks. They gave us a reason to stay inconveniently alive. Nathan looked at the grave, then at Walter, and understood at last how incomplete the story would always sound to anyone who wanted it simplified. The dogs had not been rescued by the Harrises. The Harrises had not been rescued by the dogs. It had been a mutual refusal to let the other vanish. Walter finally faced him fully. I came to tell Daniel his promise won't end with me, he said. That's all. Nathan could not answer for a moment. When he did, his voice was unsteady in the most honest way. You should never had to hold it alone this long. Walter's expression shifted, not quite toward forgiveness, not quite away from it. No, he said, but here we are. They stood together a while longer in the cemetery silence, not as soldiers exactly, not as friends yet, but as two men joined by the same overdue duty. On the drive back, Nathan did not speak much. Walter did not either. But something had changed, and the change was not loud. It was the kind that happened when a burden was finally named correctly. By noon, the town already knew Walter had been gone and returned. Small places noticed absence, the way big places noticed headlines. Claire Donnelly's article had kept spreading. A regional veterans group called. Then a church in Bozeman. Then a rancher outside Helena who had once handled military K-9s in training. Offers came in uneven waves. Not just money this time, though there was plenty of that too. Land use advice, volunteer labor, discount lumber, heated dog mats. A retired bookkeeper who offered to help form a nonprofit. A widow who wanted to cook twice a week because, as she put it in her note, old grief should never have to eat from cans. Nathan spent the afternoon making calls from the fold-out step of the van, while Walter repaired a broken cabinet hinge, and Margaret sorted medicines with Rosie, pressed faithfully against her leg. Ranger slept more than before, but each time Nathan rose to move away, the old shepherd's eyes opened and tracked him until he returned. It was no longer wariness. It was assignment. By evening, a plan had begun to take shape. Not Nathan's original plan. Not to move the dogs away, split them up, improve them by relocation and order. That had been a young solution hidden inside an older man. This one grew out of what the place already was. The RV lot itself would stay. Nathan found the owner, a widower in Arizona who had not cared for the property in years, and was startled into generosity by the story. By sunset, the sale was underway. Nathan put down the first transfer from his own savings without letting himself think too hard about how easy it had become, in retirement, to spend money on walls and tools while pretending memory was too expensive. Walter argued once. Nathan ignored him once. That was apparently enough for both of them. Over the next few weeks, though the chapter of their lives seemed to compress time around them, the lot transformed without losing its soul. The van remained where it had always stood. That mattered. New fencing went up, not to imprison, but to protect. A heated bunkhouse was built beside the lot for retired working dogs needing medical oversight. One trailer was converted into simple rooms for veterans with nowhere else to go. Another became a clinic space where Dr. Pike and Tess Monroe could examine animals without balancing supplies on a stove. Claire wrote one more article, then stopped writing, because by then she was helping schedule donations and organize volunteers instead. Linda ran blankets and groceries like a one-woman logistics command. Earl from the VFW started bringing old men out on Tuesdays to repair things no one else noticed needed fixing. Someone painted a sign by the entrance. Aris Veterans, K9, Haven, not a shelter, not a nursing home. A place where service in all its damaged forms was still recognized. The first evening the new sign went up, the sky turned gold over the lot, that deep western gold that makes even worn places look briefly chosen. Snow had melted from the gravel. The air smelled of thawing earth and coffee. The 8 old German shepherds lay where they pleased before the step van and the new bunkhouse. Shadow by the road. Rosie near Margaret's chair, Duke breathing easier under a fresh blanket, Ghost stretched in a patch of last light, Scout by the steps, the others arranged in loose, watchful ease. Ranger lay closest to Nathan. His muzzle had gone almost completely silver now, and there were more slow moments in him than strong ones. But the amber eyes remained clear. He no longer watched the highway the way he once had. Not constantly, not as if expecting another transfer, another order, another abandonment. Nathan sat in a folding chair with a mug of bad coffee between his hands. Walter sat beside him in silence, shoulders wrapped in an old wool coat. Margaret, bundled in a cream sweater and navy jacket, held her cup in both hands while Rosie rested against her knee. The three of them watched the dogs and the sunset and the small life around them that had somehow survived its own ending. No one said much. They did not need to. After a while, Nathan leaned forward and rested his hand against Ranger's neck. The old leather collar was still there, cracked with age, the faded letters hidden inside, where only someone looking too hard would ever find them. For a long moment Nathan's fingers remained on the buckle. Then, gently, he unfastened it. Walter turned his head but said nothing. Margaret watched with wet eyes, and a smile too quiet to be called happy, too peaceful to be called sad. Nathan slid the collar free and set it in his lap. Ranger did not resist. He only lifted his head once, looked toward the lot, toward the van, toward the people gathered inside the evening, and then settled again with a long, easy breath. Not because the past no longer mattered, not because memory had been erased, but because a dog who had spent years holding the perimeter finally knew he did not have to anymore. The sun slipped lower, the coffee cooled, the old dogs rested, and Nathan, with the worn collar in his hands, and the promise at last carried by more than one heart, understood something he should have learned long before war, before retirement, before loss forced it into words. A soldier only truly finishes the mission when he knows someone else will keep the promise after him. In the end, this story reminds us of something the world often forgets. Not every miracle arrives like thunder. Sometimes a miracle comes quietly. Sometimes it comes on tired legs, with old scars, gentle eyes, and a heart that refuses to leave us when life feels too heavy to bear. Nathan thought he had lost his mission. Walter and Margaret thought they had lost their reason to keep going, and those old dogs, forgotten by time and wounded by war, looked like they had been left behind by the world. But God was still writing a different ending. That is the lesson of this story. What looked like abandonment was not the end. What looked like weakness was not uselessness. What looked like delay was not God's silence. Sometimes the Lord keeps a promise alive long after human strength runs out. Sometimes He sends help through the least expected hands. A grieving old couple, a broken veteran, a wounded dog, a small town, a second chance. Maybe that is how grace often works in everyday life too. There are people around us carrying invisible pain. There are hearts sitting quietly in churches, kitchens, hospitals, parking lots, and lonely homes, waiting for one kind voice, one act of mercy, one reason to believe they have not been forgotten. And sometimes, without realizing it, we become the answer to somebody else's prayer. This story teaches us that love is not proven only in grand moments. Love is proven in showing up, in staying, in feeding the weak, in sitting beside the suffering, in keeping a promise when it would be easier to walk away. And maybe the deepest truth of all is this: God does not waste broken things. He can still use wounded people. He can still use old dogs. He can still use tired hearts. He can still build a home out of grief and hope out of what looked lost. So if this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who may need hope today. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from and what part of this story stayed with you most. And if you believe in stories of loyalty, healing, faith, and second chances, please subscribe to the channel and join this community. May God bless you, protect your home, strengthen your heart, and bring peace to every burden you are carrying today. And may He especially watch over every veteran, every lonely soul, and every faithful animal still waiting to be seen.